In anime and in manga, we as the viewers and or readers are often left with more questions than we have answers to. And that's just the reality of consuming fictional content. We're always gonna have this unquenchable need to figure out more about a universe we're invested in. And while some shows do an incredible job at answering those questions, like Hunter x Hunter and One Piece, Naruto is not one of them. But that's actually great news for me because it's how I make a living. Well, what burning question are we addressing today? This is one of the most asked and yet least answered questions in the entire Naruto fandom. I mean, there's answers written in the forms of fan fictions, but we've never really had somebody sit down, look at the information given, and try to actually extrapolate an answer. So today, I'm gonna do just that and answer the question, who are Tsunade's parents, also known as who are Hashirama's kids? And using the evidence given in a really rough timeline of the entirety of Naruto's events, I think I've actually come to an answer. But before we get to answering anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And since I'm doing a nice thing like answering an age-old question, why don't you guys do a nice thing and follow my other two YouTube pages? NC Gamer 23, where instead of talking anime, I play video games, and Hammer's Collection, where instead of talking anime while sitting down, I talk anime while building giant statues. So Tsunade. Why does everybody care about who her parents are? I mean, we don't know who Orochimaru's parents are, we don't know who Jiraiya's parents are, so why do we care about Tsunade? Well, that's because Tsunade is a Senju. And not only that, she's also technically at least a quarter Uzumaki. And when your last name is Senju, people want to figure out what your lineage is. Because we know for a fact, considering the fact that Hashirama is stated to be Tsunade's grandfather, that Hashirama had a half Senju, half Uzumaki baby at some point. And everything we know about Senjus and Uzumakis would imply that this child would be a powerhouse of legendary status. The adaptability of the Senju and the chakra pool of the Uzumaki with the life force of the two of them would make a child who would probably be stronger than Hashirama. And yet, we don't know this child's name or anything about this child, if they had a nickname, if they were a ninja or a baker or an artist. We simply know that one day they decided to have two children, Tsunade and Nawaki. And that's it, which is insane to us as readers and or viewers because somebody of this lineage probably should have been either the second or the third Hokage, and yet their only true claim to fame is creating the fifth Hokage in Tsunade. And while there is a bunch of fanfiction out there about the identity of this character, many believe him to be called Kawararama Senju or something like that, that is exactly that. Fan fiction. And I don't dabble in fan fiction. Well, that's not entirely true. I have been doing a lot of what ifs recently. My what ifs are based in fact. And that is exactly what today's video will be based off. Facts. There's obviously gonna have to be a couple of stretches in logic, but at the end of the day, I am building this argument for who Hashirama's son is and therefore Tsunade's father is based off facts. And even just in that statement right there, I've kind of already shown my hand a little bit because we know for a fact that Hashirama had at least one kid and at least one of those children had to be a boy. Why do we know this? Well, because Tsunade's last name is Senju. And in the Naruto universe, the archetypal rules of marriage, i.e. a woman takes the man's last name, still apply. That is to say that Tsunade having the last name of Senju would therefore imply that her father was a Senju. This goes doubly true in the case of Tsunade though, because in order to counteract the movements of Madara trying to isolate the Uchiha clan away from Konoha, the Senju were actually told to breed outside of the clan and actually lose their names. This would add strength to Konoha as a whole, but weaken the Senju clan as a whole, basically telling the Senjus to ditch their pride as a clan and apply it to their village. This is why we don't see any Senjus in modern day Naruto. It's not that they were massacred or moved out of the village, they just bred outside of the clan and took other people's names, which is why it's weird that Tsunade has the last name Senju. Now this is most likely to do with the fact that she was Senju royalty, obviously having Hashirama as a grandfather and Tobirama as her grand uncle. But regardless, this goes to doubly prove that Hashirama's child was more than likely a boy. Okay, cool. So we've sussed out the reason that Tsunade has a Senju last name is because her father was a Senju. But what about Tsunade's mother? Well, in order to find the answer to this question, I had to look at a couple attributes of Tsunade and not the ones you're thinking of. Though technically those ones could be used to sway the argument one way or another. You see, in order to figure out who Tsunade's mother might be, we have to look at the color of her hair. You see, blonde hair isn't necessarily very common within the confines of Naruto. There's basically two clans where we see consistent blonde hair. Those two clans would be the Namikaze in Minato and Naruto, and the Yamanaka and Ino and Inochi, and basically every other member of the Yamanaka clan, except for Fu Yamanaka, who had red hair for some reason. But you could even call his hair strawberry blonde blonde comparatively to the red hair of the Uzumaki. And I know what you're saying,
Nick, there technically is blonde hair within the Senju bloodline. Itama, Hashirama's brother who died at a young age, had half of his head blonde.
this is true. Itama did have half a head of blonde hair, but this half head of blonde hair is quite literally the only instance we ever see of blonde hair within the entirety of the Senju bloodline. Even during the Warring States period, when we see large panouts of every single member of the Senju clan, none of them have blonde hair, implying more likely to me that Itama is kind of like a genetic mix-up, which makes a lot of sense when you consider the fact that his hair color is literally split down his skull. And I know what you're saying,
Nick, well, Naoki Tsunade's little brother doesn't have blonde hair.
and you're right, he doesn't. He has light brown hair, kind of like mine, but that technically doesn't disprove anything. In fact, it might actually point to Tsunade's mother having blonde hair even more. I'm not gonna go over genetic Punnett squares with you, but blonde is technically a recessive trait, which means that it's harder to get, meaning that both of Hashirama's grandchildren turning out blonde just because their mother is blonde is a very slim chance. Also, Naoki has a relatively rare hair color within the confines of Naruto. We actually don't see a lot of light brown hair colors in Naruto. Hair colors are usually red, white, black, or blonde, with the only other real instances of light brown hair found in the Yamanaka clan. So already we have two relatively rare aesthetic traits that apply to both of Hashirama's grandchildren in Tsunade and Naoki. And both of those rare aesthetics tie them to a possible connection with the Yamanaka clan. Now, of course, technically this could also be tied to the Namikaze clan, considering we know very little about the Namikaze clan in that Minato is quite literally the only person from that clan we know of. However, we know that the Yamanaka clan was one of the earliest clans into Konoha. They came in with the Sarutobi, the Nara, and the Akamichi. This is why the Inashikacho teams were formed and the Sarutobis were chosen to look over these formations. Basically, as soon as Konoha was founded, the Yamanakas were there. And considering the fact that Hashirama's child was probably born 5 to 6 years after the formation of Konoha, would give a lot of overlap for them to meet a member of the Yamanaka clan. Also, this would very much be in line with the current interests of the Senju. I mean, Hashirama himself married outside of the clan. Therefore, he would very much encourage his own children and all of the other members of the Senju to marry outside of their clans. In Konoha, while it is now a melting pot of a multitude of variety of clans, in the early days wasn't exactly that. It was basically just the Uchiha who weren't looking to breed outside of themselves, the Senju, the Sarutobi, the Yamanaka, and the Akamichi, and the Nara. Therefore, once again, implying using our timeline that the Yamanaka would be the most logical conclusion for blonde hair to work its way into the Senju bloodline. Okay, so we've pseudo answered the question of who Tsunade's parents were. A Senju boy and a Yamanaka girl. But even answering that doesn't answer a lot of the questions we have. Most notably of which is, how would these two parents of massive power live in obscurity? Why are they never brought up by Hashirama? Why are they never brought up by Tsunade? Why are they not around today? Why doesn't Tsunade hang out with them? Why isn't Naruto met them? And you could say, well, yes, they would be very old. In modern day Naruto, Tsunade is in her mid-70s, implying that her parents would be 95 to 100. And while that may not be possible for Tsunade's Yamanaka mother, for an Uzumaki Senju child, 100 years is not that long. That's not even to mention the fact that this child would be the son of Hashirama, and therefore a clear choice for Hokage one day. So why didn't he achieve any of these things? Why did he fade into obscurity? Why does nobody talk about him? Well, in order to address that question, we once again have to look at our Naruto timeline. We can loosely estimate that Madara was probably in Konoha after its foundation for about 5-ish years before he decided to defect. But when he truly decided to defect, he captured Kurama and used him in a battle against Hashirama. In order to turn the tides of this battle in favor of Hashirama, Mito decided to seal Kurama within herself, thus stripping Madara of a very powerful weapon and making her the first Jinchuriki of Kurama and the second ever Jinchuriki. After Madara has been dealt with and killed, Hashirama and Mito return to Konoha, where apparently they're very happy about killing Madara and decide to have a child. Why am I implying that Hashirama and Mito didn't have a child until after Mito was the Jinchuriki of the Nine Tails? Well, one, because Hashirama only had eyes for Madara while Madara was alive, and two, because while Kushina was giving birth to Naruto, most of the village knew that her 8 trigram seal would be at its loosest while she was giving birth. And how would they have this kind of information if it hadn't happened prior? You see, obviously the 8 trigram seal is specific to the Uzumaki clan. They were the ones who created it. And therefore, Mito Uzumaki almost definitely used the 8 trigram seal in order to seal Kurama inside of herself. So by extrapolating the fact that they knew that this 8 trigram seal would get loose during pregnancy, you can kind of assume that this has happened before. And because of the inherent danger of a Jinchuriki having a child, Hashirama and Mito probably probably stuck to one kid, their boy. More likely than not, they realized after having their first child how dangerous it was for them to have kids, at least while Mito was a Jinchuriki. And therefore, after their first child, their boy that would go on to be Tsunade's father, they stopped. This not only makes sense from a logic standpoint, but also from a timeline standpoint, because if they had had like 6 or 7 kids, we would absolutely know one of them. However, after Mito becomes the second ever Jinchuriki, all the other villages are like, oh, that's scary that the strongest village now has a Jinchuriki, and therefore skirmishes start to break out on the borders of all the major villages. In order to quell this violence, Hashirama goes out and captures every single tailed beast and then hands them out to the 5 ninja villages. And here's where the timeline gets really confusing. Because the thing about Naruto in the First Great Shinobi World War is that it's loosely implied that directly after the 5 Kage Summit, the First Great Shinobi World War kind of started. But here's the problem. Hashirama met Tsunade. Not only just met her, spoiled her, hung out with her until she was about 5 years old. Not even just that, Hashirama says that Tsunade was his first grandchild, implying that he knew there was other ones, like Nawaki, who was probably about 5 or so years younger than Tsunade. So not only was he around until Tsunade was about 5, he also met Nawaki, who was about 0 when Tsunade was 5. But here's the thing, why that messes with Naruto's timeline means that after Madara is killed, there's about 25 years until Hashirama's death. Because obviously Hashirama's child would have to grow until they're about 20 to have a kid, and then Tsunade would have to be 5 in order to be 5 years old hanging out with Hashirama. And what's wild about that is Hashirama died in the preamble to the First Great Shinobi World War, not even in the First Great Shinobi World War, implying that after Madara's death, the First Great Shinobi World War didn't happen until, I don't know, 26, 27 years later, which destroys everything we know about timelines and correct ages. Because it's absolutely the truth, because even if you say that Mito was pregnant with Hashirama's child before she was a Jinchuriki, that would still be 22, 23 years. Because we know for a fact that Mito moved to Konoha. She moved from the village hidden in the whirlpools to Konoha to marry Hashirama, implying that Konoha was formed when Mito and Hashirama met. Which means even if he knocked her up on the first night of their marriage, it would only change the timeline by about 5 years. But why am I yelling about timelines? Well, because if there's 25 years between Madara's death and Hashirama's death, that implies that both Hashirama and Mito were present to raise their child, meaning that this child would be able to be trained by both Mito and Hashirama. And before you go off and say,
well, Hashirama was the Hokage, he didn't have time to train a child,
Tobirama was doing the lion's share of the Hokage's work from the day Hashirama entered the village. Trust me, Hashirama had time. So how does a child raised by both Mito and Hashirama, because they were both present for his life, fade into oblivion? Especially when we consider the fact that without an early death, he would probably still be around as Naruto was born. Well, in order to extrapolate the answer to this, we have to dive even further into tinfoil hat areas. You see, the anime showed us a photo of Tsunade and Hashirama interacting. Essentially, this is a photo of a very young Tsunade, probably below 5 years old, having her head pat by Hashirama. But that's not what we're interested in. What we're interested in is the woman who's holding Tsunade. The woman holding Tsunade is an elderly woman with brownish hair. And while the easy answer here would be to say, oh, it's Mito Uzumaki, that's not the truth. Because 1, Mito Uzumaki has a diamond on her head and this woman doesn't. And 2, the Uzumakis have a greater life force than the Senju and therefore age slower than them, and Hashirama looks very young in this photo. So Mito wouldn't look old yet. So who is this woman if she's not Mito Uzumaki? Well, she's not Tsunade's mother, because Tsunade's mother should have blonde hair, and she's not Tsunade's father, well, because obvious reasons. But she's dressed in a very stately, very simple kimono, implying that she's not a ninja. In fact, more likely than not, she's just hired help, which makes sense once you consider the fact that Tsunade is once again basically Konoha royalty. So to assume that there was hired help around basically raising Tsunade is not crazy. In fact, the way that this theory is going basically states that Tsunade was almost entirely raised by hired help. Why do I say this? Because the easiest answer as to why Tsunade's parents don't play a pivotal role in Naruto at all is that they're dead. And the reason that they don't play into Tsunade's trauma of losing all the people she cares about, like Dan and her little brother, is because they died before she was even really old enough to notice. You see, Hashirama died before the First Great Shinobi World War in a skirmish. Essentially, these skirmishes is what kicked up the First Great Shinobi World War in the first place. But when Tsunade is cycling through the things that she sees as traumatic, she only cites the death of her little brother and Dan, not the loss of her beloved grandfather. And this is more likely than not because she really didn't remember his death at all. She was only about 5 years old, and how many things do you remember from when you were 5? And the reason that Tsunade never talks about her parents or uses them as an example of why she's so traumatized is because they fall into the same category as Hashirama, dead before she could truly understand how much they meant to her. But her parents would have only been about 20 years old, and one of them was a half Senju, half Uzumaki baby. How could they have died? Well, it's really not that crazy to think about. I mean, look at who died in the first Great Shinobi World War. Tobirama, Hashirama, the first Kazekage, the first Raikage, the first Tsuchikage, the first Mizukage. Oh, and the second Tsuchikage. Oh, and the second Mizukage. Konoha, the Hidden Stone, and the Hidden Mist all lost 2 Kages in the first Great Shinobi World War. The Hidden Sand lost 1 Kage and the Hidden Cloud lost 1 Kage, totaling for a grand total of 9 Kage level threats dead in the first Great Shinobi World War. One of which was literally called the God of Shinobi, and one of which, in Tobirama, was so powerful he was able to kill a Mangekyo Sharingan user in Izuna. The first Great Shinobi World War saw a generation forged in the flames of the Warring States period, all fighting against each other for the first time. The strongest fighters of individual clans who had then unified were now meeting on a battlefield, where things like dust release were being shot at people using wood release, where fighters like the Gold and Silver Brothers, who were pseudo Jinchuriki of the Nine Tails, were using version 2 cloaks in the first time ever seen. The first and second Great Shinobi World Wars are modeled after World War I and World War II. In World War I, while World War I was going on, was called the War to End All Wars. It killed almost 30 million people, and therefore to assume that the first Great Shinobi World War, which is based off the First World War, was any less deadly is kind of stupid. So while yes, Hashirama's child was more than likely a powerhouse, and Tsunade's mother was probably a talented member of the Yamanaka clan, but in a war that can kill both Hashirama and Tobirama, being a powerhouse doesn't really save you from death. In fact, it probably just makes you a target. Now Tsunade, after losing her grandfather and her parents in the first Great Shinobi World War, was raised by hired help and Mito Uzumaki. But why do all of these events lead me to believe that Tsunade was raised by Mito Uzumaki? Well, remember earlier when I stated that the elderly woman in the photo holding Tsunade couldn't be Mito because she had a diamond on her forehead? Because that diamond, while slightly different in color, does exactly match the diamond on Tsunade's forehead. And that diamond on Tsunade's forehead is the strength of 100 seal, which allows her to store small pits of chakra in a chakra well that she can eventually access sometime down the line, giving her access to years of stored up chakra to increase her strength, speed, and regenerative abilities. By regenerative abilities, I mean creation rebirth. You see, this is a common misconception about the strength of 100 seal. Just having the strength of 100 seal doesn't mean you can increase your mitotic regeneration like Tsunade does. Tsunade uses the chakra she can access from her strength of 100 seal in order to fuel creation rebirth and therefore increase her regeneration ability. The same could be said for Sakura. But here's the thing about the strength of 100 seal. We know it's existed since the era of the Sage of Six Path, Hagoromo. We know this because in chapter 36 of the Boruto manga, Sakura tells Sarada all about the strength of 100 seal, and how, according to Lady Tsunade, it's existed since the era of the Sage of Six Paths. So it's not something that Tsunade created, it's been around for thousands of years. Therefore, it's not crazy to assume that Mito, who also has a diamond on her forehead, could be a strength of 100 user. And that would be where Tsunade learned it from, which once again would line up with the fact that Tsunade was raised by Mito and hired help. So is this the sexiest answer to this question of all time? No, there's no story about Tsunade's parents being hidden Anbu members who are away on a mission, destabilizing entire countries, or about Hashirama's son being this half Senju, half Uzumaki unstoppable powerhouse. But more than likely, this is exactly what happened. Hashirama's son, slated to be one of the next Hokage candidates, was probably focused on by the other villages just like Hashirama himself was. And Tsunade's mother, being just an average Yamanaka, didn't really stand much of a chance when it came to being faced with those kinds of forces. But what do I know? I've only done 2 hours of research on this topic. This was supposed to be a short day for me. What do you guys think? Who do you guys think Hashirama's children or Tsunade's parents were? Tell me in the comments below, and while you're down there, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Listen, what do I know? Maybe Tsunade's father is the fire daimyo, and the reason we never see him is because he's too busy politicking his life away.